The desert wind howled across the Columbia River Plateau, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and ancient stone. Dr. James Hartley pressed his boot against a crack in the basalt, testing its stability before hoisting himself up another few feet. At 42, he'd spent half his life studying volcanic formations, but this particular corner of eastern Washington never failed to fascinate him. The layers of cooled lava told stories millions of years old, each stratum a chapter in Earth's violent history. "Getting some good samples up here," he called down to his graduate assistant, who was supposed to be documenting their route with GPS markers. But when James glanced over his shoulder, he saw only empty desert stretching toward the horizon. His assistant had wandered back toward their vehicle, probably checking his phone signal again. James shook his head and continued climbing. "Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from." Now, back to James's journey. The rock face before him showed the telltale signs of a fissure flow, lava that had poured through narrow cracks during an eruption thousands of years ago. James pulled out his rock hammer and carefully extracted a sample, noting the olivine crystals embedded in the matrix. This was why he'd driven 3 hours from Portland, why he'd convinced the university to fund another field study. These formations held clues about the region's volcanic history that could help predict future activity. His radio crackled. "Dr. Hartley, I'm heading back to camp, storms rolling in from the west." James looked up. Dark clouds were indeed gathering, but they seemed distant enough. "Give me another hour. I want to document this outcrop before we lose the light." "Your call. Cell service is non-existent out here, so I'll see you back at the truck." That was the last conversation James would have for 26 days. The accident happened so quickly that James barely had time to process it. One moment he was traversing a narrow ledge, the next his foothold crumbled. He fell 15 feet, his body slamming against protruding rocks before landing hard on a sloped surface. Pain exploded through his left ankle and ribs. He lay still, gasping, trying to assess the damage. When he finally sat up, the world spun. His ankle was already swelling, and breathing sent sharp pains through his chest. But worse than the physical injuries was his location. He'd fallen into a narrow canyon between two lava flows, a crack in the earth barely visible from above. The walls rose 30 feet on either side, their surfaces smooth and vertical. Even uninjured, climbing out would have been nearly impossible. James fumbled for his radio. Smashed. His phone showed no signal and a cracked screen, but at least it still functioned. He took inventory, a small backpack with 2 granola bars, a half-full water bottle, his geological tools, and a lighter. Not exactly survival gear. The first night was the worst. Temperature dropped to near freezing, and James huddled against the canyon wall, his body shaking uncontrollably. The pain in his ribs made every breath agony. He knew hypothermia was a real danger, but moving was almost impossible. As darkness fell completely, he could hear coyotes howling in the distance. By morning, James had accepted his situation. His assistant would report him missing, but finding him in this vast landscape would be like locating a needle in a haystack. The canyon was invisible from above, hidden between flows that stretched for miles in every direction. He needed to focus on immediate survival. Water became his first priority. The half bottle wouldn't last long in the desert heat. James began exploring his prison, dragging his injured leg behind him. The canyon extended about 200 yards before narrowing to an impassable crack. But halfway down, he made a discovery that would save his life. A thermal vent. The opening was small, perhaps 8 inches across, but heat radiated from it like a furnace. James recognized it immediately, a geothermal feature, common in volcanic regions where underground heat still simmered close to the surface. He'd studied hundreds of these formations, but never imagined one would become his lifeline. The vent's heat was intense, nearly burning to the touch, but James realized he could use it. That night, instead of freezing, he positioned himself near the vent, using his jacket to direct the warm air around his body. The temperature was bearable, even comfortable. For the first time since the fall, he slept more than a few minutes at a time. Days blurred together. James rationed his granola bars, eating tiny portions that did little to silence his hunger. The water ran out on day 3. Desperation drove innovation. He noticed moisture condensing on the cooler canyon walls in the early morning. Using his rock hammer, he scraped lichen and dirt from a shallow depression in the basalt, creating a small collection basin. Each morning yielded perhaps a tablespoon of water, barely enough to wet his lips, but enough to keep him alive. His ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, turning deep purple and black. James fashioned a splint from branches of dead sagebrush that had blown into the canyon, binding it with strips torn from his shirt. The ribs would have to heal on their own. Every movement brought fresh waves of pain. On day 7, James heard the helicopters. He screamed until his voice gave out, waving his bright blue jacket above his head. But the aircraft passed overhead without slowing, their search pattern taking them miles to the east. They were looking for him, but in the wrong place. The realization was crushing. His assistant had probably given searchers an approximate location, but the plateau's size and the canyon's invisibility made him unfindable. That night, despair settled over him like a heavy blanket. He'd lost weight rapidly, his body consuming itself for energy. The pain in his ribs had subsided to a dull ache, but his ankle showed no signs of improvement. Even if rescue came, he wasn't sure he could signal effectively from down here. But James was a scientist, trained to observe and adapt. The thermal vent became more than just a heat source. He experimented with positioning rocks around it to create a more efficient warming system. He discovered that certain types of basalt retained heat longer than others, allowing him to warm them during the day and use them as heat sources at night. His clothing, soaked with sweat and morning dew, could be dried near the vent in a matter of hours. The heat also attracted insects, which in turn attracted lizards. James watched them for days before desperation overcame disgust. He caught his first lizard on day 12, using a snare made from his bootlace. The meat was meager, barely a mouthful, but it was protein. He cooked it over the vent, the flesh sizzling against heated rock. It tasted like survival. On day 15, James made another discovery. Following the canyon wall to its narrowest point, he found a small alcove where wind patterns had deposited decades of organic material, dead plants, animal droppings, dust. In this accumulation, tiny desert plants had taken root. Their leaves were waxy and small, adapted to store water. James carefully harvested them, crushing the leaves to extract moisture. It wasn't much, but combined with his morning condensation, it was enough. His body had adapted to starvation. The constant hunger had faded to a background sensation, replaced by a strange clarity of thought. James began to truly see his environment. He noticed how shadows moved across the canyon walls, how the thermal vent's output varied with time of day, how certain insects emerged only at dawn. He was no longer a geologist studying the earth. He was part of it, subject to its rhythms and laws. By day 20, James had accepted that he might die here. His ankle hadn't healed properly. He could feel the bones grinding wrong when he moved. His body was skeletal, every rib visible beneath his skin, but something in him refused to give up completely. Each morning, he pulled himself to his feet and checked his collection basin. Each day, he caught whatever small creatures he could. Each night, he huddled by the thermal vent, letting Earth's ancient heat keep him alive. The rescue began not with helicopters or search dogs, but with a hiker's curiosity. Tom Brennan had been photographing the plateau's geological formations for a personal project when he noticed something odd. A reflection, just a brief glint of light from what appeared to be solid rock. He was a mile away, using a telephoto lens to capture the interplay of shadow and stone. Most people would have dismissed it, but Tom had learned to trust his observations during 20 years as a wildlife photographer. He marked the location on his GPS and continued his hike, but the anomaly nagged at him. The next day, he returned with binoculars. From a different angle, he saw it again, definitely something reflective in an area that should be nothing but basalt. It could be anything, a piece of trash, a mineral deposit, even a mirage. But it could also be something important. Tom reported his observation to the Park Service, mentioning that search efforts for the missing geologist had occurred in this general area weeks ago. The ranger he spoke with was skeptical. The search had been called off after 2 weeks, and the area Tom described had been surveyed from the air multiple times, but protocol required investigation of any potential lead. Ranger Diana Foster took Tom's coordinates and assembled a small ground team. They approached from the west, following the contours of the lava flows. The terrain was brutally difficult, all sharp rock and hidden crevasses. After 3 hours of searching, they found nothing. Diana was ready to call it off when one of her team members, crouching to tie his boot, happened to look straight down into a narrow fissure. "There's something down there," he called. "Looks like fabric." Diana crawled to the edge and peered into the canyon. 30 feet below, she could see what appeared to be a bright blue jacket spread over rocks in a deliberate pattern. Her heart raced. "Hello? Is anyone down there?" The response was so faint she almost missed it. "Here, I'm here." James barely had the strength to speak. He'd heard voices before, hallucinations brought on by dehydration and starvation. But this seemed real. He forced himself to move, dragging his broken body toward the sound. When he looked up, he saw faces peering down at him, backlit by the afternoon sun. Angels or rescue workers, he couldn't tell and didn't care. "We've got him," Diana radioed to base. "One survivor, condition unknown, requesting immediate medical evacuation." The next hour was a blur of activity. A technical rescue team arrived with ropes and a litter. They rappelled into the canyon, and James watched them descend like visitors from another world. When the first rescuer reached him, the man's face went pale. "Jesus," he whispered, keying his radio. "Advise medical to prepare for severe dehydration and malnutrition. Patient appears to have been here for—" "How long have you been down here, sir?" 26 days, James croaked, "give or take." The rescuer's eyes widened. Survival for that long in these conditions should have been impossible. "How did you—" James gestured weakly toward the thermal vent, still radiating its steady heat. "The earth," he said simply. "It kept me warm." They stabilized him as best they could in the canyon before beginning the delicate process of hauling him to the surface. Every movement sent pain through his damaged ribs, and his ankles screamed in protest. But James felt almost euphoric. He was going to live. Against all odds, he was going to survive. At the rim, paramedics immediately started 2 IV lines, pumping fluids into his dehydrated body. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his heart rate erratic. They loaded him into the helicopter that had landed on a flat section of Plateau, and within minutes, James was airborne, watching the canyon that had been his prison shrink below him. The flight to the hospital in Bend, Oregon, took 30 minutes. James drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation between the flight medic and the hospital. Massive weight loss, possible kidney damage, ankle definitely broken, remarkable, he's alive. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around him. They were particularly concerned about kidney failure from dehydration and muscle breakdown from starvation. His ankle required immediate surgery. The bones had begun healing at wrong angles and would need to be rebroken and set properly. But the medical team's primary concern was simply keeping him stable. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the emergency room physician who supervised his initial treatment, would later tell reporters that James's survival was extraordinary. "We see cases of exposure all the time in the wilderness, but 26 days with essentially no food or water should be fatal. The fact that he found a heat source and had the presence of mind to use it for survival shows remarkable resourcefulness." James spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The surgery on his ankle was complicated, requiring pins and plates to reconstruct the joint. His ribs, cracked but not displaced, healed on their own. The weight he'd lost came back slowly, his digestive system needing time to readjust to regular food. But the physical recovery was easier than the psychological one. Nightmares plagued him. He'd wake in his hospital bed, convinced he was still in the canyon, that the hospital was just another hallucination. The sound of the heating system would trigger panic attacks. It reminded him too much of the thermal vent, that constant reminder of how close he'd been to death. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with PTSD and recommended continued therapy after discharge. His graduate assistant visited, face heavy with guilt. "I should have noticed you were missing sooner," the young man said. "I thought you'd gone exploring and would catch up. By the time I realized something was wrong and reported it, you'd already been out there for hours." James didn't blame him. The plateau was vast, and people regularly spent hours or even days pursuing their research. The real issue had been the fall, the bad luck of landing in an invisible canyon. But he understood survivors' guilt. He felt it himself, wondering about all the decisions that had led to that moment. The media descended once news of his rescue spread. The story had everything: a professor lost in the wilderness, impossible survival against the odds, rescue by a photographer's keen eye. James gave a few interviews from his hospital bed, downplaying the drama and emphasizing the role of scientific knowledge in his survival. "I knew the thermal vent was dangerous," he explained to one reporter. "Geothermal features can release toxic gases or suddenly increase in temperature. But I also understood the geology well enough to assess the risk. That vent had probably been there for thousands of years, maintaining a steady output. It was as reliable as anything in nature can be." Tom Brennan, the photographer who'd spotted the reflection, visited James in the hospital. The two men shared a quiet moment, both understanding how close things had come to a different ending. "What made you come back to look?" James asked. Tom shrugged. "I'm a photographer. I've learned that unusual things in nature usually have explanations, and sometimes those explanations are important. I thought it might be mineral deposits reflecting light, which would have been interesting. I never imagined it was someone's jacket being used as a signal." The jacket, James's bright blue rain shell, had indeed been the key. He'd realized early on that blue contrasted sharply with the brown and black of the basalt. While he couldn't climb out to signal, he could arrange the jacket in different positions on the canyon floor, hoping someone might spot it from the right angle. It had taken weeks, but eventually someone had. The university held a small celebration when James was finally released from the hospital. His colleagues were amazed by his survival story, though some questioned why he'd continued climbing alone that day. James didn't have a good answer beyond the arrogance of experience. He'd thought he knew the terrain well enough, had believed his skills sufficient. The plateau had taught him humility. His ankle would never fully recover. Doctors told him the damage was too severe. He'd walk with a permanent limp and likely experience chronic pain. Rock climbing, his favorite part of field research, was over. But James found he didn't mourn it as much as he'd expected. His perspective had shifted during those 26 days. 6 months after his rescue, James returned to the canyon. He went with a full support team, proper safety equipment, and a documentary crew that was filming his story. Standing at the rim, looking down into the narrow space that had nearly killed him, he felt a strange mix of emotions. "I spent weeks cursing this place," he told the camera. Every morning I woke up in pain, hungry, terrified, but I also learned things here that I couldn't have learned anywhere else, about survival, about the earth, about myself. They rappelled down, and James showed them his collection basin, still holding a thin film of morning condensation. He pointed out the thermal vent, still radiating heat as it had for millennia. The lizards still hunted there, attracted by the warmth and the insects. The desert plants still grew in their tiny alcove, extracting life from bare rock. The documentary team filmed everything, marveling at the ingenuity of his survival system. But what struck them most was James's reverence for the canyon. He spoke about it not as a prison, but as a teacher, harsh and unforgiving, but ultimately life-giving through that one geological feature. This vent represents millions of years of volcanic activity, James explained, his hand hovering over the heat. Magma chambers cooling deep underground, heat working its way to the surface through cracks in the rock. It's been here long before humans existed and will be here long after we're gone. For 26 days, it kept me alive. I used my knowledge of geology to understand it, but I also had to respect it, work with it, let it teach me patience. The experience changed James's career trajectory. He became an advocate for wilderness safety, developing training programs that combined geological knowledge with survival skills. His lectures at the university now included extensive discussions about risk assessment and emergency preparedness. He trained graduate students not just in research methodology, but in understanding their physical limits and the environments they studied. He also wrote a book about his experience, titled Heat from Below, 26 Days in the Earth's Embrace. The proceeds went to funding search and rescue operations in the Columbia River Plateau. The book became a minor bestseller, appealing to both geology enthusiasts and survival story readers. James used his platform to highlight the importance of geological research and the need to respect wilderness areas. His relationship with his wife, which had been strained by his constant fieldwork, improved dramatically. She'd spent those 26 days in anguish, balancing hope and grief, trying to prepare for the worst while praying for the best. When he finally called her from the hospital, they'd both wept. Now, James made sure his research trips included proper safety protocols and regular check-ins. He brought her to the canyon a year after the rescue, and they stood together at the rim. "I was so angry at this place," she said quietly. "It took you from me, but it also gave you back." James nodded. "It taught me what matters, not publications or tenure or being first to document some formation. What matters is going home to you, being there for our kids, living fully." The thermal vent became something of a pilgrimage site for geologists and survival enthusiasts. The Park Service installed a viewing platform above the canyon with interpretive signs explaining the geology and James's survival story. They discouraged entering the canyon itself, but people could peer down and see the vent, still doing what it had done for thousands of years, releasing the Earth's ancient heat to the surface. Tom Brennan's photograph, the one that had captured the reflection of James's jacket, was displayed at the visitor center. It showed the vast emptiness of the plateau, the layers of basalt stretching to the horizon, and there, almost invisible without knowing where to look, a tiny glint of blue. The caption read, "Never stop looking, never give up hope." James occasionally gave talks at the visitor center, sharing his story with tourists and student groups. He always emphasized the same points: respect nature, prepare properly, and never underestimate the power of geological knowledge. But he also talked about something deeper, the relationship between humans and the earth, how we're part of natural systems, not separate from them. "That thermal vent didn't save me out of kindness," he'd explained. "It has no awareness, no intention. It's just heat escaping through rock, following the laws of thermodynamics. But I was able to use my understanding of those laws to survive. Science isn't just abstract knowledge, it's a tool for living, for understanding our place in the world. His ankle continued to trouble him. Some mornings he could barely walk, the pain sharp and persistent. But he'd learned to manage it, accepting it as the price of survival. Physical therapy helped, as did the custom brace he wore. He joked that he was now a lowland geologist, focusing on accessible formations rather than challenging climbs. The PTSD gradually lessened, though it never fully disappeared. Certain sounds or smells could trigger memories: the crackle of a campfire, the scent of sage, the feeling of intense heat. But therapy gave him tools to manage the responses, and time smoothed the sharpest edges of trauma. He learned to view the experience not as something that happened to him, but as something that transformed him. 3 years after the rescue, James testified before a congressional committee examining funding for geological research and wilderness safety. He spoke about the importance of understanding volcanic regions, not just for academic purposes, but for practical applications, including emergency survival. His testimony, combined with his compelling personal story, helped secure increased funding for the USGS Volcanic Hazards Program. He also worked with search and rescue teams, teaching them about geological features that could aid or hinder rescue efforts. His insights about thermal vents, natural shelters, and water sources in volcanic landscapes became part of their training curriculum. Several rescue operations credited his teachings with successful outcomes. Diana Foster, the ranger who'd coordinated his rescue, became a close friend. They collaborated on a wilderness safety program that combined her practical rescue experience with his geological expertise. The program was implemented across multiple national parks in the Pacific Northwest, training both visitors and staff in recognizing geological hazards and resources. "You gave us a case study we'll never forget," Diana told him during one of their planning sessions. "Most survival stories involve someone doing everything right. Yours is about someone who made mistakes, got unlucky, but had the knowledge and determination to survive anyway. That's more valuable because it's more real." James's children, now teenagers, sometimes accompanied him on low-risk field trips. They'd grown up hearing the story of their father's survival, but experiencing the landscape firsthand gave them new appreciation. His daughter developed an interest in geology, much to his delight. His son preferred biology, but understood the interconnection between disciplines. "Dad, that vent that saved you," his son asked during one trip, "does it ever make you think about climate change? Like how we're changing the Earth's systems without really understanding the consequences?" The question delighted James. "Absolutely. That vent is part of a stable system that's existed for millennia. But we're changing global temperature patterns, which affects everything from groundwater to volcanic activity. We need to understand these systems before we break them beyond repair." The canyon itself remained largely unchanged. Wind and weather continued their slow work of erosion. The thermal vent maintained its steady output. Lizards hunted, plants grew in their alcove, morning condensation collected in the basin James had created. Nature proceeded according to its own rhythms, indifferent to the human drama that had played out there. James's last visit to the canyon came 5 years after his rescue. He was 50 now, his hair graying, his limp permanent, but his eyes still lit up when discussing geology, and his passion for teaching had only intensified. He stood at the viewing platform with a group of students, pointing out the geological features that made the area unique. "This landscape saved my life," he told them, "not through mercy or kindness, but through the simple physics of heat transfer. I was able to survive because I understood the science well enough to recognize an opportunity. That's the power of knowledge. It doesn't just help us understand the world, it helps us live in it." One student raised her hand. "Doctor, Hartley, do you ever regret going into that canyon? I mean, would you have been better off never experiencing that? James considered the question carefully. I regret the pain I caused my family. I regret the mistakes that put me in that situation. But the experience itself, no, I don't regret it. It taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. It made me a better scientist, a better teacher, a better person. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable. As the sun set over the Columbia River Plateau, painting the basalt in shades of orange and gold, James felt a deep sense of peace. The canyon below was just a crack in the earth, nothing special to most eyes. But to him, it represented the thin line between life and death, the power of knowledge, and the unexpected grace of geological processes indifferent to human suffering. The thermal vent continued its work, heating the air above it, a small but constant reminder that the Earth is alive with energy, ancient and ongoing. James had spent 26 days learning to respect that energy, to work with it rather than against it. That lesson had become the cornerstone of his life's work, teaching others to understand the Earth not as something to conquer, but as something to comprehend and coexist with. As they walked back to the vehicles, James paused for one last look at the canyon. Somewhere down there, his collection basin still caught morning dew, the thermal vent still radiated heat. The Earth continued its patient work, indifferent to individual lives, but capable, through understanding, of sustaining them. It was a humbling thought and an inspiring one. He climbed into the van, his students chattering excitedly about what they'd learned. Tomorrow they'd analyze rock samples, discuss geological processes, debate theories. But today they'd stood on the edge of a place where theory had become survival, where abstract knowledge had kept a man alive against impossible odds. That was a lesson no textbook could teach. The plateau receded behind them as they drove toward Portland, the landscape returning to its ancient silence. And deep in a hidden canyon, heat rose from the Earth's depths, warming the air, sustaining life in the harshest environment, waiting patiently for the next story to unfold.